Welcome. Welcome everybody to day 2 of the Parliament as a Gendered Workplace workshop. Let me start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose traditional lands we're meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Let me also acknowledge the presence of our ANU Vice-Chancellor, Brian Schmidt. Very pleased to see you here. I'm sorry about this frog in my throat. Well, yesterday we looked at the broad issues around Parliament as a gendered workplace, the reasons that many women don't experience Parliament House as a safe working place, and we looked at what comparable parliaments are doing to make Parliament a safer workplace. Today, we're narrowing down a bit and we're focusing on what is needed in Australia in terms of an enforceable code of conduct, which will ensure that we move towards a more gender equal workplace in Parliament. We've succeeded in increasing the presence of women, both as politicians and as staffers, but we haven't succeeded so far in providing a gender equal workplace for them. So we're going to have some experts on this issue speaking to us in this first session. We'll have Maley, who's an internationally acclaimed researcher on ministerial staff. We'll have Chris Wallace, who's a former staffer and journalist who is now an associate professor in the 2020 Foundation at the University of Canberra. She'll also be bringing her strategic skills to bear on this question about how we can move to a safer workplace in Parliament. And we'll have Melissa Donnelly, the National Secretary of the Community and Public Sector Union, who's been negotiating the enterprise bargain covering parliamentary staff and trying to include some sexual harassment protections there. She'll be joining us online from Sydney for obvious reasons. In terms of our online participants, we do remind them that they should be jotting down points as they occur to them on the Padlet, and they have the code to do that. We want to gather as much evidence and reflections as we can to help inform our submission to the review of Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. So hopefully our online participants will be contributing all along, as well as putting up questions in the chat function. But I think we should start off the session now with Marian Maley, and could you all welcome her?
Thank you, Marian, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand today. My paper is lengthy, so if anyone would like to read it, I'd be very happy to send you a copy. Just drop me a line here. This paper is based on years I've spent researching federal ministerial staff, including their working conditions, and some recent research I've been doing involving interviews and data gathering. But first, I wanted to make some empirical observations. We have a very large number of staff who are what we would call federal political staffers. In March, they were 2,020 people employed under the Members of Parliament Staff Act. And they have very different employment arrangements than you find in other countries. And that's something important to remember when we're looking at applying models from elsewhere, that they have in some ways quite different employment arrangements. There are different people within that cohort as well. We have electorate officers as well as ministerial staff. And while they have very similar experiences, they have very different work contexts, career patterns, and different forms of accountability, something to bear in mind. I would argue that political offices are a significant site of women's political engagement in Australia. So it's interesting that in contrast to Parliament, which has always been seen as a male domain, in which women were sort of space invaders, the political office has been traditionally dominated by women. And that's because most of the roles in that office were usually administrative secretarial roles held by women. And today they do form the majority of staff in political offices, 57% of MOP staff, and in electorate offices more than 60%. So women are more likely to be found in working in political offices than actually in elected positions or in the parliament. I think that's important. And one of the reasons behind that is I think that the role of the staffer doesn't transgress traditional gender roles. In fact, it conforms to the traditional gender role in its auxiliary nature. So the handmaiden who sublimates her own ambitions to support and protect the power holder is very much a female role. But while there's some sort of comfortableness in that, it is a problematic working environment because there are very strong limitations on the powers staffers can wield, and also their position is inherently vulnerable, and they are subject to masculine hierarchies and cultures. Just quickly, some data about women in federal ministers' offices. So this is a subset of the group. This is based on some research I've done where I collected data about 1,275 ministerial staff who were working between 2010 and 2017. So they were working in the Rudd, Gillard, Abbott and Turnbull governments, and I've analysed them and their careers. First of all, 90% of the administrative staff were women. So you can see that that class of person is very much female. But I separated them out and just looked at the advisory staff, so the political and policy advisors and chiefs of staff, and 43% of them were female. However, moving to sort of more powerful positions of chiefs of staff, you can see that there were fewer women in those powerful chiefs of staff roles. Yet in the offices of more junior ministers, they were 50%. So that's interesting to see that they are there in significant numbers. They're often not in the most powerful. But what I thought was interesting was there was a different age profile between the male and female advisors. And this chart, if you can see, it just shows the age when they were recruited as a ministerial advisor. So you can see that this is men, this is women. Women were recruited at younger ages, mostly under 30, and there was a steep drop-off after the age of 40, whereas men kept on being recruited into their 40s and beyond. So I think they're a younger cohort than the men they're working with. That's just a bit of background. I want to talk about the work environment because if we want to address some of the problems, we need to understand what are the causes of those problems. And I think the causes are both structural and cultural. So in brief, what's one of the structural problems is that the dominance and submission relationship is hardwired into the employment relationship. This is because it's the parliamentarian who's empowered to define what work's needed. It's very much based on their needs. Some staffers I've interviewed had no job description. So that meant there was no boundary around what they're expected to do. They could always face criticism for not performing to what was needed. The parliamentarian's also the only party who can act in the employment relationship. So that gives them an enormous amount of power. And also there's extreme differences in tenure, staffers being able to be sacked if they lose the confidence of their employer, very precarious, whereas parliamentarians, as we heard yesterday, apparently untouchable in their tenure. But I think that there are more deeper problems as well on the cultural level. And for me, one of the most critical problems is the definition of political offices as private spaces. So, you know, they are officially designated as personal staff. Ministers refer to them as my private office. And this norm breeds a sense of entitlement and that parliamentarians and staffers can act with impunity outside rules and regulations because it's a private space. And yet it is public sector employment. And I'm going to go on to say, I think guess, a big change we could make to see it as such, to see it as public sector employment. But not only is it seen as a private space, but it's also seen as a secret space, and that's particularly characteristic of Australia. Other countries don't have the secrecy around their offices that we do, and that secrecy, I think, contributes to the normalisation and cover-up of poor conduct. Another fundamental problem is that staff are not necessarily employed on merit. So staffers I interviewed say, look, merit and professional standards don't seem to have any currency in a world that's underpinned by patronage. So one said to me, fairness is not necessarily part of your working environment because I wasn't necessarily employed in a fair way. So as soon as merit is not involved, then that opens up the opportunity for unfair behaviour. And finally, I think the careers of staff is a big problem in this area. So there's often no career development for staff, particularly in electorate offices. Moving outside of an MP's office can be a career cliff. So you can struggle to find your footing in the job market, and often staffers rely on selling their contact books as the asset they take forward, which means they can't afford to accrue the relationships which they are basically selling into their future job prospects. This means that they will put up with bullying so that they can ultimately maintain those relationships, and they face very high stakes decisions when they want to complain. So moving on to what can be done. I think what can be done has to address some of those fundamental problems. In terms of the power dynamic, I think that would change if we brought more parties into the employment relationship. So at the moment, under the MOPS Act, we only have the parliamentarian and the staffer. However, the Prime Minister is also present in that relationship. So it says in the MOPS Act that parliamentarians employ staff in accordance with arrangements approved by the Prime Minister. That power has really not been used by the Prime Minister, and could be in terms of mandating conditions such as no staffer can be employed without undergoing mandatory training, or that no MP can employ staff without undergoing mandatory training, or that limits could be placed on the staffing allocations of particular MPs who have a history of misconduct. There is power already in the MOPS Act unused, but I would say we actually need to bring other parties into that employment relationship. Apart from the Prime Minister, we could have a cross-party staffing committee or other types of bodies that would be involved in that employment relationship. In other countries, there are more players in the employment relationship. For example, in the UK, special advisors who are actually employed as temporary civil servants in departments therefore have the permanent head of that department, as well as their minister, as well as the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, all are involved in the employment relationship. In terms of careers, I think that a change in the way we look at things could be if staffers were employed as a group by the political party. That means they could be managed more as resources for a political party. They could be developed in terms of their skills, managed over time, and that would mean that the party would need to take greater responsibility for their careers and how they treated them. I think that could be also one thing to consider. A code of conduct, very important. Without a code of conduct, we can't really move forward, but the question is, how is it enforced? Obviously, an independent body is the gold standard, but even if that wasn't possible, a cross-party committee, a cross-party conduct committee with community members also on the committee to recognise that the community has an interest in the conduct of MPs would be another way to go. But whatever happens in terms of enforcing a code of conduct, you would need significant buy-in from all parties to make that work. In terms of changing the norms, I think bringing greater professionalism, formality into the work of staffers, as Marian O'Gorman talked about yesterday, insisting that all positions are advertised, for example. But that goes to this issue, which I think is the most important one, of changing the way we see them so that we see them as public sector workers. In other countries, they're seen as such, but they're seen as civil servants with three differences. They're not permanent, they're not recruited necessarily on merit, and they don't have to be impartial in their work, but otherwise they're expected to have the same levels of professionalism and integrity as a public servant. So if you start to see them as such, rather than as a private group of people working in a secretive domain, I think that would change a lot. However, I think there are vested interests amongst politicians to keep them in that private space.
Thank you so much, Maria. That's really set us up for considering what should go into our submission to the independent review. And if I can now call on Chris Wallace, who I believe is with us. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Marian. I'd like to acknowledge we meet today on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and honour their elders, past and present. I'd also just like to, as we did yesterday, mention Marian Sims's passing. And I just want to say to this Marian, no pegging out, Marian. Between the two of you, you've been the pillar of feminist political science in Canberra and Australia and internationally for a very, very long time. You are very precious people. We've lost one of you, so there's going to be an all-out institutional effort to preserve you forever, even if it's necessary at some point to do it Jeremy Bentham style. I'm sure Brian can source some formaldehyde for us if necessary. And can I also thank Maria Maley, who, you know, I think a very unheralded political scientist, very much in the tradition of the Marians. Yes, I'd like to endorse that. The kind of work political scientists like the Marians and Maria and the coming generation like Blair are doing. This is the critical spade work to generate the detail that's necessary to get change right. You know, it's easy to do dumb change, but to the extent your work before us has informed incredibly good moves in Australian public policy, I really salute you. So I think it's fair to say that there's a consensus at the workshop. You'll be completely unsurprised, so we probably all thought this before we got here, that a code of conduct for respectful relationships in Parliament as a workplace is desirable. And as we were saying at dinner last night, the short, clear 7-point code developed by a cross-party group of New Zealand parliamentarians in 2020, as Karen drew our attention to yesterday, seems like a very good model. It's short, it's clearly understood. As we were saying last night, even Craig Kelly could not miss the point. And we do tend to kind of wrap things in too many words and big words. And I think as academics, as privileged educated people, we often forget just how much that suppresses the message we're trying to get through. So simplicity, clarity, brevity, excellent things. I think there's also a consensus here, again, unsurprising, that a robust, independent complaints process is essential for the full spectrum of Parliament's workforce: MPs, staffers, journalists, administrators, and professional security and other services staff and contractors. And, you know, people like Julia Banks and Kate Ellis, amongst others, have been calling for this publicly for a while. Underreporting, I think, should be expected. And the idea in our submission to the Kate Jenkins inquiry that I would suggest we need to add the suggestion that regular anonymous surveys with published summaries that are publicly and widely available are necessary to mind the gap between reporting and lived experience in Parliament House as a workplace. I think we all agree that these measures are necessary, but I would argue strongly not sufficient because of parliamentary offenders' amplified sense of entitlement, something which lies at the heart of the offences every time one plunges into the awful details. British academic Lola Olafemi, for example, makes the point so eloquently, and I quote, "Rapists know that rape is wrong and still commit it because of a sense of entitlement to someone else's bodily autonomy." Cecilia Josephson and Josephina Eriksson, yesterday shared with us their research showing the formal gender equity improvements evident in the Swedish Riksdag, while the informal situation remains dire. So a code of conduct and an independent complaints mechanism, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient to address the gendered abuse of power we are routinely and forever have been witnessing. The entitled expect their fellows to perpetuate the privilege they individually and collectively enjoy. Statistics on low reporting rates and even lower conviction rates of gendered violence show that assumption is usually fulfilled. This has been the case for a very long time. Even recently, we have a half-century long scholarly, policy and activist body of knowledge concerning its empirical, theoretical and practical dimensions. Yet the chronic record of bullying, harassment and assault by boys and men against each other, something important to remember, but to a vastly greater extent against women, girls, non-binary and trans people, continues barely trammelled. Contemporary cases occasionally come to light and momentarily focus minds on Parliament as a gendered workplace. This was the case in relation to the Australian Parliament in a recent stark sequence of events. And just to remind you, they began on 9 November last year when Louise Milligan's Four Corners report Inside the Canberra Bubble aired. This was followed by the announcement on 25 January of Grace Tame as the 2021 Australian of the Year. News.com.au journalist Samantha Maiden's report followed on the alleged rape of former Morrison government staffer Brittany Higgins by a fellow staffer. And then we had Louise Milligan's report on the alleged historical rape by an unnamed minister who subsequently self-disclosed as Attorney General Christian Porter. These events unfolded as former MPs Kate Ellis and Julia Banks published detailed accounts of their experience of Parliament as a gendered workplace. Ellis recounted routine gendered weaponisation of sexual gossip, often invented by colleagues against women MPs, and provided a moving account of the emotional labour and logistics of combining caregiving and parliamentary politics. Banks detailed misogynistic manipulation by male colleagues, including Prime Minister Scott Morrison, whom she likened to a menacing, controlling wallpaper, as well as sexual harassment by male Liberal MPs, including a still-serving Cabinet Minister. No penalty beyond an insignificant rearrangement of ministerial responsibilities for two members of the Morrison government, one of them a woman, has occurred as a result of the chain of events since the Canberra bubble aired 8 months ago, and nor is any in sight. Rather, there has been a graphic display of the entitled perpetuating the privilege they individually and collectively enjoy. And in fact, it has got worse. The National Party restored to its leadership Barnaby Joyce, a man with unresolved sexual harassment claims against him, the internal inquiry into which was conducted by a former Nationals official who was himself the subject of an apprehended domestic violence application subsequently withdrawn. Joyce now again occupies the second highest office in the land. And that Nationals official recently won a safe position on the LNP's New South Wales Senate ticket and will be a senator in Canberra after the next election. Note, I referred to the entitled, not to entitled men, because in a significant and insufficiently noticed development, LNP women have visibly emerged as willing, enthusiastic enablers and defenders of gendered privilege in the Australian Parliament in return for their own individual advancement. Nationals Minister Bridget McKenzie was one of the two key players engineering Barnaby Joyce's return to the Deputy Prime Ministership. She was rewarded with her own restoration to Cabinet. Using similar lines in a likely coordinated attack, a string of Liberal women ministers have defended Morrison and his government against Banks's revelations and critique. Dubbed by Banks, Morrison's wallpaper women. They include Amanda Stoker, Katie Allen and Sarah Henderson. One of the Morrison government's most rapid career rises, Jane Hume, has been used on offence against Banks from the time Banks spoke out against the LNP leadership change thuggery in 2018. The rise of LNP women as willing tools of gendered privilege. Wallpaper women doing wallpaper man's political dirty work cannot be ignored by those seeking to make parliaments places of respect at work. It puts values, political values, centrally in the frame. It has big implications for diversity. If gender equity in the federal LNP meant more wallpaper women coming to Canberra to defend male privilege, that really does not count in any reasonable person's book as progress. So how to make Parliament a place of respect at work? I think the first thing, and I really want you to go away today and take this to heart after what's been a fabulous workshop, is I think we all need to stop and reflect long and hard on the fact that exhortation does not equal action. Noting, as I've often heard in the last 2 days and with colleagues generally, noting that the forces at work are cultural, structural, systemic, only leads us so far. Saying it is not changing anything. We have to understand that political change does not come from ever finer analysis of the problem, though sound analysis is essential. Political change comes through building support behind a set of ideas and organising for the election of representatives who will implement those ideas. That's politics, the purposive acquisition and exercise of power to specific ends. If you want Parliament to be the site of respect at work, actively organise and work to elect representatives who will make that happen. Secondly, real diversity must be achieved in parliamentary ecosystems and real inclusion. This is the only way to undercut gendered and allied power imbalances that underpin and sustain the pervasive male privilege bedeviling our politics and our society. This means a shift in rhetoric and action to support 40-40-20 quota systems over 50-50 quota systems. It means inducing the embrace of quota systems, especially where they are not wanted, because that is where they are most needed. How to do it? Making the receipt of federal public funding of any kind, electoral funding, grants, contracts, and all the other forms of Australian government financial transfers, contingent on receiving entities having and over time demonstrating progress on 40-40-20 quota systems is the way to make it happen. Money talks. Money talks. In many situations, it's the only thing that talks. Obviously, this kind of initiative could only be enacted by progressive governments. Conservative governments, as with their attacks over time on other constructive public action in health and education and the like, would likely in office seek to undo such an initiative. But if progressive governments routinely restore them when returned to government, over time they could, and I believe would, do their work. So we have to take more far-reaching action than we perhaps have realised, requiring a lot more concrete political organising and effort than we perhaps feel like doing to make parliaments a place of respect at work. Political action is necessary if parliaments are not to fall inexorably under the noxious sway of menacing wallpaper men and wallpaper women, as is visibly occurring as we watch on today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I'll just remind everybody that we're having questions after the three speakers rather than in between. And so we'll now move to Melissa Donnelly in Sydney. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Marian. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting you all today from Sydney on Gadigal land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us for this workshop today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all about what is really an important issue for my union and our members. And we have been doing a lot of work over the course of this year, but over a long period of time, about the kinds of issues around sexual harassment and bullying and workplace harassment that is unfortunately front page news over the course of this year. So I'm National Secretary of the Community and Public Sector Union, and we cover political staffers who work under the MOPS Act and have membership across a whole range of political parties, both people who work primarily in electorate offices, but also people who work in more senior advisory positions. From our perspective, Parliament House, for many people, first and foremost is a workplace. And it is a workplace not just for parliamentarians, which, you know, we've had a number of very able speakers over the course of yesterday talk to the range of gender issues that parliamentarians and others face, but for the over 2,000 staff working under the MOPS Act across 227 offices, as well as thousands of other workers, from parliamentary to security to House of Reps and Senate committee staff to journalists to cleaners to people working in the parliamentary library. And our concern absolutely is that people working in this workplace deserve the same standards and the same kind of behaviour that they can expect in their workplace that should apply in any Australian workplace. But of course, what we've found over the course of the you know, revelations that have come to light is, you know, that is not the lived experience of so many people. I thought it would, we've had lots of very capable speakers, so I'll try not to traverse the same ground, but I thought it'd be useful to give people a perspective of what it's like for political staffers and where their sentiment really is at the moment. I think for many of our members who work in political offices, they're incredibly frustrated. They've seen allegations from very brave people really bring forward and bring their workplace to the epicentre of a national debate on sexual harassment, sexual assault and bullying in the workplace. But they're frustrated because there's been so much talk and it's not really been matched by action by the government. We have seen over the course of this year in the enterprise bargaining that the CPSU has been involved in, the government unwilling to commit to enterprise agreement provisions that deal with gendered violence and provide better protections for staff. So whilst we at times have statements and others and you know, press releases from the government, it's not actually being matched by action. Similarly, we've seen over a long period of time a really lacklustre approach to workplace health and safety in this workplace. In every workplace health and safety committee meeting for 2 years, the CPSU raised the issue of sexual harassment, and the Department of Finance was pretty uninterested in addressing those kind of issues. In fact, we had to campaign to get sexual harassment recognised in the bullying policy as a specific risk profile for this workplace. And the other, I guess, important thing, I think, as we think about the next steps and codes of conduct and what might come out of the Jenkins review, is I think it's important that these issues aren't just worked out between political parties. These are not matters just for political parties to work out between each other about what's acceptable and palatable. There needs to be a very strong voice for staff in that process who are often on the receiving end of these kind of behaviours and really face quite difficult circumstances about how to raise that. We need to listen to their voices. Political staffers face a really complicated, what we have called a triangular relationship. That is because parliamentarians employ their own staff. They have quite specific powers around hiring and firing their staff. So parliamentarians make employment decisions, but the Department of Finance undertakes human resource functions. And this creates real practical difficulties for employees about how they advance concerns they may have that arise in their workplace. There is also, of course, a really significant asymmetric power imbalance. Kate Ellis spoke about this very eloquently yesterday about, obviously the gender power imbalance. And for women staffers, women in staffer roles, that can be really compounded quite significantly, both by gender and then the hierarchy of the workplace. And of course, staffers work in a really highly intense culture. In sitting weeks, working 14-hour days is a really common occurrence, if not an expectation. You work in an environment where your relationship and allegiance to your political party is paramount. And you work in an environment where you are working very closely with someone who is potentially a very powerful person in Australian democracy and Australian government, which also denies you voice and opportunity. So this has really specific and serious consequences when you put these factors together for these staff. We undertook a survey last year before the Brittany Higgins allegations came to light, but we asked our members about what they'd experienced in the workplace. And in the preceding 12 months, 40% of respondents had experienced bullying or harassment. More than 50% of respondents had witnessed bullying or harassment. And 14% of respondents had experienced violence in the workplace. These are really significant cohorts of people who are either experiencing directly or witnessing bullying or harassment, and then even more concerningly, violence in the workplace. But even with those findings, less than 20% of respondents reported bullying and harassment. There is absolutely, structurally and culturally, a disincentive to report. So 67% of those believe the issue might get worse if they chose to report it. 60% of people believe their career may be threatened. And I think that goes to the issues of patronage that Maria was speaking about earlier, and how that intersects with people's decisions. And 82% of respondents felt that they would not be supported by finance through the process. So what actually happens in real terms is a staffer who may be experiencing bullying or harassment in the workplace, if they're unable, through a direct conversation, if they want to decide to make a report, they do that to the Department of Finance. The Department of Finance can investigate that, can look into those circumstances and make some findings, but has no capacity to enforce it. That report is then given back to the office in which you work. And it may well be that that report is given to one of the alleged perpetrators of the bullying and harassment behaviour that you're concerned about. So for our union and from our perspective, the workplace culture and the lack of proper structures around some of these processes is absolutely really concerning, and is one of the things that has to be addressed through the Jenkins process. So what do workers want? We have, we have members not just in MOPS, although these findings relate to MOPS employees. We also have members in other public sector roles within Parliament House. But we have been doing a lot of work advocating for the issues they want to see resolved in this process. So one of the most significant issues for our members is resolving that complaint process. They want an independent and confidential complaints process. They also want a safe workplace that guarantees health and safety rights. There has been over a long time a really half-hearted approach to workplace health and safety in political offices. It has at times been seen as a bit of a joke, that it's not something that politicians and others need to actually worry themselves about. We sought an enterprise agreement provisions to mitigate violence and harassment in the workplace. These things, of course, in and of themselves don't stop the culture that drives some of these behaviours, but we did think it was really important that there was a clear statement from government in an enforceable document with clear processes for employees. Unfortunately, the Department of Finance and the government were unwilling to do that through the bargaining process. We also think there needs to be appropriate specialised support services for people who have experienced bullying, harassment or sexual harassment in the workplace. And we have been calling for some time around the full implementation of the Respect at Work recommendations from the work of Kate Jenkins through that earlier review. So as we go about the next stages, our perspective is we think it needs to not be lost, that Parliament House is a workplace to thousands of workers, to thousands of people in all sorts of roles, and we need to therefore respect and enforce workplace health and safety standards in that building. There are a whole range of ways that should be achieved, including through proper training, induction and HR processes. Many people, I'm sure, saw the news yesterday that as an outcome of the Foster review, the government has tendered for optional 1-hour training for sexual harassment, optional for politicians, that is. Like, I think that, that gives our members absolutely no confidence that this government is serious about changing workplace culture and instituting practices that are really mainstream in most of the corporate world and most of the APS world at this point in time. There needs to be an independent complaint mechanism, which I spoke about before, and as obviously is the topic for these workshops around the code of conduct, we need to work out a way that there are consequences for bad behaviour. People do not have confidence that there will be consequences, even if they have experienced quite difficult and terrible behaviour. People are very often as likely to quit their job rather than hope for an outcome through a process. So I think, just to sum up, we are hopeful that the Jenkins review does provide a moment in time to address some of these quite long-standing problems that have existed for MOPS employees and in political offices. I think none of us, though, should underestimate what it will take to achieve that kind of reform, both at a policy level and a workplace culture level, and no doubt with some legislative changes perhaps being required, given at times the government has been quick to talk but pretty slow to actually take real substantive action to address these really significant concerns. Thank you.
Okay, so now time for questions. We'll be taking questions both from participants here and from our online participants. Okay,
So any questions from the audience? Caitlin? Oh, sorry, Kim first and then Caitlin. My bad.
Microphone first. Thank you for all of those presentations. It was very powerful. I wanted to pick up on Maria's point about the public-private distinction, and I think that's a really powerful one that we need to interrogate a little more. And it's not unlike legal frameworks in public law when government outsources what has been otherwise government functions to private enterprises, that it has changed the legal framework for the administrative law principles that have applied. And some judges pick up on the notion that it really doesn't matter who the entity is, it's about the power that's being exercised. And I wonder if that's another way also of being able to challenge that distinction in terms of saying anyone, no matter whether they be in public or private context, who's exercising a form of power that has an impact on the public, has a responsibility to uphold the same public principles. And to that end, I was thinking from Melissa's recognition of how finances reports go back into the private domain. Perhaps one of the interventions we would recommend is thinking that any of those reports actually go back to a body like the Human Rights Commission or the Sex Discrimination Commission or some public institutional framework which is set up to actually mediate, review, determine questions about improper exercise of power, whether it be sexual harassment or bullying. And the reason why I think of the Sex Discrimination Commission as well is how she has looked at these issues in all different domains, like the recent gymnastics report, for instance, and how each sector presumes the norms in those sectors are appropriate when in fact someone outside can look in and show power. But it's a mix of sort of commentary, but a question as to whether we need to set up an independent public institution or framework to review these sorts of matters.
So who'd like to answer that one first? Thanks, Kim. I mean, one of the really difficult things about the role of staff is that they have no powers. So this is one of the reasons why they can't be regulated very easily, because they have no official powers. Ministers are not allowed to delegate any powers to them. So they are a sort of agent only of a minister. And that's why they've seen as sort of part of the personality of the minister, therefore drawing them into a private sort of arrangement with the minister. So they do not exercise any formal powers. So they probably couldn't be captured in that way that you're suggesting, unfortunately.
Is exercising power over them, and that's what's going.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yep. No, that's a great idea. I'll leave Melissa to answer the second part of your question.
Sorry, it was a tiny bit hard to hear. Blair, would you mind repeating the second part of the question for me?
No, there's the right tone.
She's going to back.
Sorry, the other microphone wasn't working. Minister, I was just asking whether the financial report, which you said goes back to the Minister's office, would it be more appropriate if we set up a structure for the financial report to go to an independent body like the Sex Discrimination Commission or the Human Rights Commission, to set up a new framework where any of those reports about improper exercise of power goes to a public body?
Yeah, sorry about that. So from a worker perspective, it needs to go to a body or go through a process after an investigation that can lead to consequences that have some level of independence. I think that there are differing levels of issues, of course. We have very serious assault and criminal allegations, some of which have, of course, been aired publicly, and there needs to be apart from the criminal process, really significant workplace behaviour needs to go through a body that can provide an outcome. We don't necessarily have a view about exactly what that body is or how it exists. What we are focused on is making sure that that process actually can guarantee an outcome. We also need to lift the workplace culture in this building. So when people do have a lower level concern, like I don't like the way you speak to me, they actually can have some confidence to raise that and think that they may be listened to. Now, that's what we expect in workplaces all around this country. But at the moment, because both the power imbalance and the structures in place offer no outlet, people just accept whatever happens. Often people are asked to just accept whatever happens. Like, there are so few ways to actually address it.
Chris, would you like to answer? Or Maria? All good? So next, we'll get speakers up to the microphone so it doesn't distort it for the online viewers. Caitlin, just move the mic.
Yeah. Sorry. So I've got a question around something at the National Security College we've been discussing for the past year, is how the APS has quite rigorous, depending on which department it is, background checks for staffers and especially for senior levels. It's really contested that we should have a background check for not only political candidates during pre-selection, but also for staffers. Do you think there is any possible mechanism for a similar process like the APS background checks to happen within Parliament?
Who would like to answer that one? Come to the microphone. Yes. Sorry about that.
Very briefly, what would be the point when the Deputy Prime Minister has unresolved sexual violence allegations against them right now and is currently the #2 office holder in the land? Again, it speaks to the fact that, we all desperately want process solutions to things that are power and values problems. And so much worthy effort, attention, energy is devoted to process matters, which are critical. I mean, we've just heard from a union official who's describing a completely flawed, toxic, not just impossible to work process. And yes, it must be fixed, but it will not be fixed by people who support the values of the perps. That's power, that's politics. You've got to change the people who are exercising power to solve those problems. So you can have all the background checks you like, when people with unresolved sexual violence allegations against them are restored actively to positions of extreme responsibility over the entire nation, it's a process tweak that's likely not going to work, in my view.
Maria or Melissa?
I don't disagree at all with that. Like, you know, I think that there is a whole range of things over the course of this year where, you know, there's been, as I said, a lot more talk than action, which shows perhaps at times there's been a tendency to manage these issues as political issues rather than actually seek a resolution. I also think as well, in terms of some of those recruitment processes and so on, the changes that need to be made to bring some of that up to speed, like inductions, consistent job descriptions, those kind of things. There's a hell of a lot that needs to be done, but there needs to be the will to do it and the actual commitment.
Definitely. Maria or Chris? Oh, sorry about the relay action going.
I totally agree with that. I mean, you'd be surprised about how informal and unprofessional recruitment is, how people find themselves in positions they have no training for, they have no resources to support them in doing those jobs they find themselves in. Bringing professionalism into recruitment and training is really critical, I think.
Thank you. So we have a question from the online people. So a question from Chris Black, who is a former advisor to Nicola Roxon and secretary of the Elizabeth Reed Network. And they say that, I'm concerned that Maria's presentation paints a picture of all female staff being young, inexperienced, and unmeritorious. For many of us, this was simply not the case. Can the conversation please recognize the significant talent, expertise, and contributions of female staff, not just refer to us as helpless handmaidens? Ooh. Any retort or comment on that?
Yeah, I'm sorry if I gave that impression. That's not the impression I wanted to give at all. In fact, when I showed the data about the number of women who were heading up important offices, I wanted to make the point that actually women were significantly present in this domain of power, and that it was a very important site of their engagement. I do not want to in any way say that they were handmaidens. What I was trying to explain was that women can actually go into that role without transgressing or breaking traditional gender norms, and also compared to a politician, they're not under the same sort of scrutiny. So in fact, it does attract some women who are very talented, who are very powerful, and they make a great contribution in those roles.
Brilliant answer, thank you. Does Chris, Melissa, do you guys? All good? Okay, so I'll do another online question before I open up to the audience, the face-to-face audience again. So from Kerry Thornton, who says, Mariana talked yesterday about the fact political staffers roles are not advertised and that staffers feel loyal to the party because they are party members. I did answer an advertisement 21 years ago to work for the Australian Democrats. I was not a member of the party and was not required to become one. I worked with a lot of female members of parliament and it was a very respectful environment, even with the long hours and presence of alcohol. Is there an argument for making the recruitment process to staff more transparent and removing the need for party membership? Who would like to answer? Melissa, perhaps?
Pardon me. Look, I think that there is an argument absolutely about looking at recruitment processes and trying to professionalise those. In part, and I'm sorry, one of the early speakers to me mentioned this, it also would, from a staff or worker perspective, give people more confidence about the basis on which they're there and how they deal with any concerns that they may have to in their workplace and advocate if they need to for themselves. So I think that there's an argument absolutely around how we can improve that. It is very light on some of the requirements around these processes. In terms of the question about political party membership and recruitment, I mean, I think political parties probably will continue to have a view, and it may differ between political parties, but on those matters. And obviously it's a political environment. So, politicians do want you know, you generally don't want to work for a politician if you don't agree with their general political view. But I do think there's a range of things that should be looked at in terms of the recruitment processes, which would actually both professionalise, and taking Chris Black's comment from before, you know, the work of MOP staff is incredibly professional, high level work. So the lack of professionalism in the recruitment is not a reflection of staff, it's just a reflection on a system that has not been updated, in part because it's always put into too hard basket.
Thank you. Chris or Marian? All good? Any question from the audience? If you'd like to come up and ask yourself.
Just echoing, I guess, a little bit what Chris was saying. It strikes me that we do need to professionalize and do all these things within the MOP staff, absolutely. But in the end, I could do that same type of activity here at this university where I have similar sets of problems. And if there is not accountability, then it's going to fail, precisely because when people have essentially no end to their power, the people who complain end up just being flushed out and having their careers destroyed. So we have a challenge that in the past, the media was very, highly curated and was able to essentially provide accountability because these things came out and it destroyed people's careers, and it worked with the political system of what was acceptable or not. We've seen that erosion over the last 10 or 15 years, I think largely due to the erosion of the power of the media and its ability to curate things. And I think we need to find a way to bring accountability, and I think that will help Chris actually get political change of the right people in power. But without accountability, I think we're going to have a real problem, because we can have the best legal framework in the world, but I can tell you that when I have a problem with this university, if my staff or student has to go through the legal framework, 97% of the time, they give up before they get there. It's up to me as the head of this organization to fix it before it goes legal. Because if I wait for the legal system, it kills the poor person making the complaint.
Thank you, Brian. Any response to that?
That's dead on 100% right. And it brings us straight back to values. We're living in this kind of post-shame netherworld in federal politics that doesn't exist elsewhere. If you tried to have as your COO a man with unresolved sexual harassment claims against him, you would resign out of shame, you would off him, or we would be writing at your office, right? There would be a consequence for inaction. To the extent that on the conservative side of politics, not just in Australia, but generally, these kinds of outrageous values are being projected and enacted and tolerated and enabled in a sustained and brazen manner, is an incredible decay in our system, in our life, in our very being. And until there's some sort of reassertion of decent values and good government with transaction costs for bad values and bad government, we're doomed. And we are not going to get that from the current conservative offering. That is why concrete political organisation and action is the threshold task for anyone who seeks any concrete improvement in the areas I think everyone at this workshop over these 2 days cares about. That comes down to us doing the boring thing of joining political parties or running as independents, doing the letterboxing, doing the lobbying, building support. I spoke about Banks's and Ellis's book. There's a magnificent book by Susan Ryan, who 50 years ago last month had newly returned from New York. Her marriage ended. She had 2 small kids in tow. She was living on marginal income from the ANU and the then Canberra College of Advanced Education as a tutor, totally down in the depths. What did she do? She became active in the local women's movement. She recruited women who were feminist activists alongside her to join the Labor Party. She worked and organised the numbers to get her own pre-selection. She became a senator for the ACT 4 years after arriving back from New York in this dire state. She lobbied internally to get the support for the sex discrimination bill, which she put up as a bill as a private member's bill in the Senate while Labor was in opposition. She enacted in government with the support of the Hawke government. A magnificent piece of concrete organisation with direct results from which we are all benefiting today. But what I hear in contemporary discourse is merit, unfairness, it's not happening, we need to tweak this detail or that detail. What I don't see is a bunch of Susan Ryans running around recruiting people with feminist values, inserting them in political parties, building the numbers in Parliament to get stuff done. That's the missing bit of the discourse over the last 2 days, and it's something to reflect on as a takeaway from the workshop.
Thanks, Chris. Brilliant, powerful. Maria?
Yeah, I think this issue of accountability is the critical one, but also the most difficult one in this environment. And the way I see it is that we really need to do major cultural change, which will take time. And the cultural change relates to politicians and how they see their sense of entitlement, how they see conduct, that it's actually should be regulated, that staff have rights and their welfare is important, that they're not expendable. All these attitudes have to change. How can they change? Well, accountability is very important and people being held to account. But in the short term, I think this is why investigating historical cases is so important, because we've got to be realistic about the challenges that people face in bringing complaints. However, if they have left and are able to bring those complaints can still impact on that person whose conduct was not acceptable. And over time, if that happens frequently and strongly, even though those people have left, that will change attitudes. I think that's a beginning point anyway, in changing attitudes.
Thank you. And Melissa, do you have any response?
Look, I think the issue of there needs to be consequences is absolutely the $60 million question here. But I think, and I think, like in any system, and speaking as a industrial relations lawyer, once it does get into a system, you've already got a problem. What we need to aim for is the cultural change within the political environment and political parties for this behaviour to be, and people who behave in this way to be unacceptable. And that is a longer term project, and there are of course limitations with that and with the current government about how we make that case, but we also have to put the asset on all political parties about what is acceptable in this modern Australia and what is not.
The microphone is free and I'm here. Can I ask a question of the panel, please? I recognise that none of you have touched on parliamentary staff, and I'm just wondering whether any of you are familiar with the experience of parliamentary staff and what could be done to strengthen their experiences of, strengthen the regulation around their experience of sexual harassment, given that it is actually a very political environment, even though they are technically public servants, or they're parliamentary servants with a special act.
I might start on that one if that's okay. So the CPSU does cover DPS and other employees in public sector roles within Parliament House, and that of course extends through to security services and a whole range of other functions. The kind of issues around power imbalances also apply to those staff, and we are in the process of making a submission to the Jenkins Review about the experiences of those staff, and sometimes committee member staff of course travel with senators and parliamentarians to committee hearings, etc. So a range of issues as well. Their reporting regime is not as complicated as that MOP staff has faced, but the power imbalance is the same, and therefore the risk profile and some of the, I guess, risks inherent to that working relationship are still there. I think what improves the situation for those staff, in my opinion, is changes in workplace culture and changes in understanding and expectations of people who work in Parliament House about appropriate standards and just raising the level overall. As I said, their reporting regime around complaints is not as complicated, but really I think all would benefit, all face the same power imbalance, and all would benefit from that raising of standards and professionalisation.
So I am a former staffer. I worked as a staffer in Old Parliament House, and I worked as a journalist in Old Parliament House and New Parliament House. And, a slight other point of difference I haven't mentioned perhaps between my view of proceedings over the last 2 days and most of you is I see much more in common between Parliament as a workplace and other kinds of workplaces than I do see distinctions. So, for example, as a staffer, I did not experience different conditions than a late night hospitality worker in a bar or a restaurant. Lots of tired, overextended people doing the theatre of performing their job, lots of alcohol, lots of excitement, difficulties getting home, the usual palaver. I see a lot in common between that kind of workplace and Parliament House. Ditto, talk to anyone who's been a woman who's worked on an oil rig. I think everyone in those situations wants the same thing. They want there to be accountability. They want there to be consequences for miscreants. That is what's missing. And in fact, we could turn around the problem we've been looking at for the last 2 days and go, how do we make the workplace safe for the late night barmaid? If we can do that, if we can make the justice system work, if we can get accountability for that person, we can certainly do it for a parliamentary staffer. So, we're coming back to very fundamental problems in the way we're running society that come back to the precise way the justice system works, the deep dysfunctionality of the way the police operate, that are going to require very far-reaching solutions, not just a tweak or here or there. Doing those things would massively benefit every worker in Parliament House of every kind as well.
Thanks so much, Chris. Any further responses before we move on? Cool. So we have Carol Johnson, who's going to ask a question all the way from Adelaide. Carol? I think you're on mute. Just unmute yourself.
Unmute. There we are.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I can't be with you due to border closures. Basically, this is a question for Maria and Melissa. The terms of reference of the Jenkins Review contain the following words. The aim of the review is to ensure all Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces are safe and respectful. And it goes on to say later, the review will consider recommendations to ensure that the people who work in parliamentary workplaces are treated with dignity and respect, unquote. Yet one of the areas that seems to be left out is media coverage. And Blair's sections of our joint paper that we delivered yesterday show how crucial a role the news media can play in making the workplace of parliamentarians unsafe and disrespectful. And I'd add that some media coverage of staff complaints have had a similar effect. They've made the workplace unsafe and disrespectful for staff. My question is, does the Parliamentary Press Gallery also need to develop a professional voluntary code of conduct designed to prevent sexist coverage of both parliamentarians and staff? It would probably have to be voluntary to avoid cries of censorship and cries of attacks on freedom of speech, but it might at least encourage journalists to be more reflective about media content in the ways that Blair suggested in the joint paper we delivered yesterday.
Thanks for your comment, Carol. Chris, would you like to answer that first, or as a former journo? Not to attack, but...
Yes, well, I know Carol directed the question specifically not to me, but I'll...
You're welcome to answer, Chris.
I'll weigh in generally anyway. it's a very, very big problem. I loved your presentation yesterday, Blair and Carol, but as I sat there, I thought, but wait a minute, what has happened since November has been almost entirely down to the work of excellent women journalists, often reporting to excellent women chiefs of staff or producers, and in some cases, editors. And in fact, I'm working on a separate paper at the minute on whether this is a kind of a critical mass moment for women in the media, leading to very directly excellent impacts on the political system. And I think we've got to pause and recognise and juxtapose that against the excellent work Carol, you and Blair have done on the horrific treatment of Julia Gillard and others. Two very important things to consider in tandem. But to illustrate the complexity of what you're suggesting, is there anyone in the room who would disagree that Annabel Crabb is an excellent feminist journalist? No, we all agree that Annabel Crabb is an excellent journalist and an excellent feminist. In her report last Friday, I'm reading in bed her foreshadowing of her new television series, and she refers to Julia Banks's anecdote in her book, horrific anecdote, about awaiting a crucial parliamentary vote in the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's office, where she and her colleagues are pinned up so that none of them can miss this vital vote. She's sitting there talking to a cabinet minister who then puts his hand on her thigh, and I can't describe it the way she does in the book, but it's chilling as he runs his hand all the way up her thigh with this casual brazenness, and then gets up, walks away to have a word with someone, and then comes back and she flees. I won't go on with the rest of the anecdote. Annabel's account of this in her Friday email referred to the minister fondling Banks's leg. Now, we all love and support Annabel as a journalist, friend and feminist, but that was really not good journalism. So when it's even the good feminist journalists that are not thoughtful about what words specifically mean, convey, signify, the impact they have, it just underlines how much work we've got to do.
Fantastic point there, Chris. Thank you. Maria, you look ready to answer that question?
I would just point out that the role of the media is critical in the power dynamics that we've been talking about, because it's the obsessive secrecy of politicians to keep everything around them away from the media, unseen by the public, is because of the pressure they feel from the media. So they are a player in driving things underground, having things covered up. So I think the media does play a very important role in this whole power dynamic.
Thanks, Maria. And Melissa, would you like to answer that?
This is perhaps not my entire area of expertise, but undoubtedly it plays into the power dynamic that occurs at times as well, you know, as evidenced by the Canberra bubble title in and of itself. It helps also fend off discoveries of things that might not be palatable in the broader community. So I think it is important in terms of what the answer is and how we best address that. There is a lot of complexity.
Thanks, Melissa. Any other questions from the audience? Fiona, would you like to come down?
Yeah, this is a question to Chris, really. I mean, I think the sort of questions that you raise about the way power is at stake here and the way in which power clearly is often channeled through this kind of bullying, harassing, thuggish kind of behaviour. And the fact that Scott Morrison hasn't responded more constructively to the criticism suggests that he still thinks that there's a lot of vested interest in maintaining that kind of power. So when you think about the importance of diversity in these contexts, and I was very, you know, your challenge to the idea that 50-50 is exactly the answer, and the role that women can play in maintaining these situations of thuggish kinds of power, let's say. How do you then think about how diversity becomes a solution to these problems?
Brilliant question, thank you. And Chris?
Yes, you can always count on Fiona for the hard question. It's an excellent question, and I would answer it partly by casting women of a certain age in the room to think back to the 1980s, to the revelation many of us had when we went, many socialist feminists had, that went, wow, you could have a socialist revolution and still have patriarchy, right? So the equivalent contemporary revelation is, wow, you could have gender parity in federal parliament and you could still have patriarchy. This is a really big deal revelation that has largely not happened. And once you see it, you cannot not embrace 40-40-20 instead of 50-50. Because the fact is, the wallpaper women, as Julia Banks has dubbed them, are as notchous as the men. Bridget McKenzie and Barnaby Joyce, there's nothing to pick between them. 40-40-20 is a very nascent, undeveloped concept. I'm working on it actively at the minute. It's fabulous because it is a metric reminder constantly that there's more than one kind of diversity. If we achieved gender diversity, but not racial diversity and all the other kinds of necessary diversities, we haven't done enough to change the dynamics underpinning patriarchy. We've got to complicate our own challenge in a way that may seem unhelpful and may seem like it makes it more difficult, but I would argue actually is an exciting and dynamic new thing to use in the mix, because 40-40-20 is very contextual. You know, you've got to work out what it means in every specific context. It's going to mean different things in different places and different kinds of entities. But if you're always having to be reminded that there are other kinds of diversity, I think you can avoid the situation when you end up with the wallpaper women and the wallpaper men running the world. And just as a footnote, I think much of the alleged crisis of democracy and lack of the declining faith that's measured in many surveys about democracy, to me, actually is more likely a proxy for a deep yearning for decent, effective government, independent often of these things, like, to take the current COVID crisis around the world, specifically in Australia. How hard is it to roll out a quick, effective mass vaccination program? We do it every year with the flu. How hard is it to see that we need a national chain of dedicated, effective remote quarantine facilities around the nation, because we're going to be using them regularly over the next century because of increasingly proximate pandemics under pressures of climate change? I mean, the bleeding obvious. But will the government do it? No. I mean, the government that will deliver an appealing leader with decent values who can deliver basic good government, I think could be in Australia for a very long time if they can ever get elected over the wallpaper men and women in the first place.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other response to that, or should we move to the next question? So Marian, would you like to ask a question?
No, I think, it's probably time that we brought this session to a close, just because we have a bit of explanation to do about what comes next. What I've heard this morning has been wonderful and has not changed my mind that we really need to recommend a strong code of conduct setting out what are appropriate standards of behaviour in the parliamentary precinct, and that this should be an enforceable code of conduct, i.e. that we should have a statutory body like the Independent Parliamentary Expenses Authority, which will oversight the implementation of the code of conduct, which will also oversight appropriate training in employment practices. As we've heard this morning, no such appropriate training exists at the moment for large numbers of MOP staff and so on. So oversight of implementation of the code, oversight of training, and receipt of complaints, not just the serious incidents which the Foster Review has been addressing, but more generally, to be able to receive complaints of all forms of harassment and bullying and sexual harassment, but not just sexual harassment. We've heard, I think, over the 2 days that there are many forms of microaggression which cause gendered harms to those working in Parliament, which don't have a sexual component to them. So a body that can receive all forms of complaints and report annually on these complaints, hopefully we'll have this backed up by the kind of surveys that Chris has mentioned, which would measure how parliamentary workplaces are being experienced, what kind of harassment, bullying or sexual harassment is being experienced, so that that data can be compared to the annual reports of complaints lodged, so we know whether there is still that kind of difficulty of current parliamentary staff reporting inappropriate behaviour, which many of our speakers have reflected upon, and which makes so important the independent complaint handling body having the power to look at historic cases, which Maria has mentioned this morning. So I believe that these are the kinds of things which we need to knuckle down and consider in our next working session on the submission to the independent or the Jenkins review of Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. I think that this morning's session has been wonderfully valuable in really clarifying some of the complexities of trying to reform employment practices in Parliament. And we have to take all of these complexities on board in fashioning some recommendations. So thanks so much to our 3 speakers in this session for their expertise and strategic insights into the questions. Please join with me in thanking our speakers.